Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Samantha MacLeod. Samantha is an accomplished professional with more than 20 years' experience supporting business strategies through technology enablement, risk management, security and governance. In her role as CISO at AGL, Samantha is accountable for aligning cybersecurity strategy with business initiatives and integrating security practices across the organisation. Previously, as the General Manager of Cybersecurity at ME, Samantha and the cybersecurity team secured the organisation's digital assets and customer information, led with security technology in a changing threat landscape. As an advocate for women in IT and women in leadership, Samantha encourages others to develop their careers in technology and in cybersecurity. Samantha is passionate about people, leadership, and building security teams aligned to digital and innovative cultures. She advocates for innovative and creative thinking in solving cybersecurity problems. Sam, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we've heard a little bit about you in your bio, but tell us a little bit more about how you got to this point in your career as a leader, and how did you go from a commerce degree to being a Chief Information Security Officer?
So my first job out of uni was with a major Aussie bank, and when I walked through the door, they threw me into IT service management and ITIL. So I got quite a grounding in everything relating to IT governance and good frameworks and how you go about supporting and managing and looking after your tech. But from there, I went into GE Capital. I was given a few more opportunities to do very similar work, but I remember in about 2004, while I was doing the first ever IT Sarbanes-Oxley audit for a US firm, that I'd really like to do more in the IT security space. And I thought at some point in my career, I'm going to go back and have a look at that and do something there. So, fast forward through a few consulting gigs and working for a huge US vendor in key account management and sales, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. I found myself back at GE Capital, but working for the US business as their IT risk solutions director, and it was for all of Asia Pac. And really that role was all about security tools and technologies and capabilities like data loss prevention and security monitoring and identity and access management, security analytics, those sorts of things. And I found that was my first true security role where I was looking after 14 businesses across Australia and Asia. It was fantastic. And as a result of that and what I did in that role, my first CISO role came about for the Tier 2 bank ME a few years later. And now I'm in my second, much bigger ASX-listed company as a CISO.
Well, so it sounds like over your career, you've built teams in all different sorts of environments and organisations. If you were the first person to arrive in a security team, what do you think would be your immediate priorities? Who do you think you'd need to hire first?
You know what? Your first hire is really your security architect, your enterprise architect for security, for want of a better term. It's a really good question because I've walked into a couple of places now where I've had to look at the operating model, determine what the right team is going to be, and it's really daunting to determine where you're going to start sometimes. So I've learned the most valuable hire is your security EA. It's someone who can partner with you, get visibility to the security capability within the organisation, look at the lay of land and tell you where your biggest gaps are and help you build out that strategy and design the activities that are going to help you build out a capability. I think after that, though, really quickly, I follow up with a security risk-focused kind of person, someone who can look at a framework for security and controls and set some standards. And then it's a juggling act around where you go, whether you look at your security champions and your awareness and your advocacy and communicating security across the business, or whether you go more into the visibility of the true security vulnerabilities that you might have in the organisation and build out a SOC or a forensics capability. But certainly start with that partner who's got great breadth and depth to bring some understanding to the security landscape for the organisation in that EA.
And so if you start there and you started to talk about the ways that you would build out the breadth of the security team, if you think about even further than that, and I know you're in critical infrastructure at the moment where there's often discussions about this converged security model where you bring in not only the SOC and the IT security functions, but also broader around operational technologies, physical security, corporate security. What are your thoughts around that converged model? Because it's becoming quite a popular conversation. I'm just interested in your opinion.
It's popular across a couple of industries, actually, not even just critical infrastructure. So I think it's something that a number of our big Aussie banks have been looking at. And look, it's an interesting dichotomy, right? Because we've got Internet of Things, we've got proliferation of devices, we've got, from my perspective, a whole heap of different IoT out at generation sites, which we've never had before, because typically you think your big SCADA platforms where, the Homer Simpson like panels that the guys are operating to make sure nothing goes horribly wrong out at gen sites. But that these days I'm also looking at the security of drones. I'm looking at which are used out at gen sites now to hover over our environments and report back on, water tabling and heat issues and safety issues and things like that. And we've also got sensors on our generation assets that tell us how well they're performing and whether or not an issue is likely to occur. And that gets churned up in a big data appliance. So it's not just about corporate security anymore. It's not just about information security. And the umbrella is huge, as you say. Physical security is interesting given gen sites. Sure, I want security teams, to security guards reporting into me, for want of a better example. But certainly the data that's being generated out of those sites are really, really valuable, as is the data just from our corporate sites as well. And I know my purist InfoSec people are going to tell me don't do it, but and I'm wrestling with it a little bit. But given we're all about securing data at the end of the day, and we use our systems to do that, my gut tells me, we have to accept the convergence of IT, IoT, OT, and it's the ecosystems that we're looking after. So at the moment, I have cyber, I have InfoSec, I have corporate sec, and I have OT security. I don't have physical, don't have first line fraud or financial crime, but I can see in the future where the value of extending that ecosystem from a security point of view and sharing the data, it's going to give me a more holistic view and an end-to-end security view of human security risks and some insights into what's going on from a security perspective for the organisation.
And I think too, as you sort of put your arms around more and more parts of security in different organisations, it's very hard to know sort of the elasticity of those teams and whether or not you should hire lots of people to be in-house and learning and building up that security IP, or you should be trusting some of that work to third parties that's kind of their bread and butter. What's your opinion around the types of roles that you should be or could be outsourced, and those that absolutely fundamentally have to be an in-house hire?
It's a really interesting question. So for me, looking at my teams, where I have high value activity that's going to drive significant business outcomes, I'm very much about insourcing the capability. Where we're talking about high transaction and lots of turnover, and perhaps even where I guess the expertise needs to be quite robust and scalable, and I can't do that internally, I tend to look more at the outsourcing models. So I recently took that premise of bringing in a lot of the capability into AGL, where previously it had been outsourced. And for me, it was all about looking at the value we wanted to give to the business of enabling them from a security perspective, rather than being just a governance function or the department of no, but where we could also be able to, long live teams and create career paths for people, where you breed that loyalty into how we go about doing the job, and we actually building our capability with a view of longevity. So for me, insourcing things where it's about business engagement, or it's about, the security operations centre, which we've built out here, and forensic roles. I think it's really important to have career paths for people around those to come ground up and work through the organisation. But where we don't have the skills, and the skills are hard to get, and certainly hard to get on scale, whether it's, identity and access management, or doing lots of, supply chain or third party reviews, or even some of the enterprise platform security tasks, we do still tend to outsource those, but we do it discreetly with niche vendors who can actually provide, good on the ground capability for us.
And so when you're talking about bringing the people into your organisation for specific outcomes, or sort of those high value outcomes, Given that a lot of people are saying that we're experiencing a skills crisis, how have your hiring practices had to change to accommodate the need for highly sought after skills?
I've always been someone who's called BS on the skills shortage, so I have a little bit of a chuckle at that question. I've kind of looked at it as a self-fulfilling prophecy or something we use to draw a lot more attention to our industry. I come from the school that security skills can be learnt. I don't think what we do is a dark art, and I don't think you need 25 years experience to make a difference in a security team. So when I needed to build a new team around a new operating model, all of the roles were marketed internally before I went externally. And we leveraged our executive team to target IT and business people who we thought were willing to learn security skills and willing to develop in security roles, and asked them to come and have a conversation about coming on board. As a result of that, I've hired people from business operations teams, from HR, from our digital teams, IT risk, and also for out of corporate projects. They've taken on security projects, they've taken on sec DevOps roles, business engagement roles, and security assurance type roles in the team as well. In order to help them, though, there was a commitment by us to provide security training to them. So we've got people working with Coder Academy, with Box Hill TAFE on a Cert 4, and we've got lots of CISMs and SIPs going on all over the place. But in addition to that, to really fill some of the gaps that we've had, and in order to give back, I guess, to the industry itself, we've had quite a few industry-based placements from university. So we've got a few of those, and we've also got, cyber undergrads doing, and a master's student actually doing an internship. So we're trying to really grow skills from the ground up. Look, and to complement that, once we'd fulfilled some of those roles internally, we certainly went externally and looked for people across industry. And a lot of that external hire has been done on good faith and referrals as well. We didn't have to do a lot of advertising, because CISOs talk, and we all want our organisations to be seen as breeding grounds for fantastic talent across the industry. And at some point, our people hit, I guess, a ceiling where there's nowhere for them to go in our organisations, and we'd like to see them continue to develop and bring more and more to those in-house skill sets that we have across our organisations. So we've been able to find some of those hardcore techies, some of those really curious problem solvers, and people interested in that critical infrastructure piece that bring lots of different experiences and can make my team a breeding ground for talent as well. But they also fill the gaps, and it creates quite a diverse team as well.
I mean, you are doing everything. I mean, you're taking in all of the potential opportunities that you can to not only take in, our security leaders of tomorrow, but also to upskill those staff within your organisation who have an affinity for security or have the sort of skills and traits that you're after. Have you found that any of those have sort of not worked out, or is there any that you'd sort of be willing to talk about where it wasn't the right option for them?
Not yet, touch wood. It could still happen. We're quite a new team, if I use that particular example. So I think we're still going through, in some ways, our forming, and in others, our storming. Yeah. So the hardest thing to do, though, in creating that team has been, I guess, finding the talent for roles that haven't really previously existed out in market. So, the one thing that didn't really work well for me was going to our internal recruitment team and saying, hey, so for this role, I want a person who has previously worked in a vendor doing sales. They're really consultative. They may have even had a failed startup or been part of a failed startup. I want someone that's failed something and learnt a whole heap of lessons in that engineering, sec DevOps kind of space, but someone who's not highly technical, so they're really good at having a conversation. And they're all about strategy and engagement and how to support a business team and how to work in what might be a partially federated security model. And it was really interesting because apparently that was a unicorn that no one had ever recruited for before, and I was more likely to find a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So I had to flex a bit, and it was really a good reminder that, security itself is in a state of change, and we might have moved, going back to what we were talking about before, moved from true InfoSec to cyber and now to IT/OT and continuous development teams and platforms. But there's lots now in the cyber bucket, and we don't yet have all the people behind that to be able to deliver the outcomes. So it's not so much that I have seen anyone fail yet in the roles that we've put them in. Actually, I hope someone has a hiccup so that we can learn from what those failures are. Terrible thing to say, isn't it? But at some point we will. But the harder thing has been actually finding the people prepared to jump in and have a go.
Yeah, I think that, and certainly not, I'm with you. I'm hoping that people don't fail, but that we get some learnings. But there's definitely change going on in the world, and something I've certainly noticed, and I noticed that you spoke recently at a Salaries event around startups and this changing gig economy, and I think it's really bringing new ways of us engaging with expertise. But do you think that we could be losing some of the in-house or potential in-house security professionals to some of these new micro businesses? And it's harder and harder to fill roles in-house. Is it because they're going out and starting up new businesses to try to solve other cybersecurity problems?
Look, I think we do lose them to in-house roles. But that said, I think we need those people who are getting frustrated with the way we've always done things to step out of that mold and to challenge the industry and to challenge the status quo. I'm a huge supporter of developing our industry around cyber and who's there and who's innovating and who's being really entrepreneurial. It's really important. So organisations like Cyber and Salaries, helping out the talent in that space is absolutely critical, because I think the gig economy is the one that's potentially going to solve the systemic problems that CISOs and security teams face into and can't solve. Can't find the solutions for. We don't have, in the throes of day-to-day or in the throes of supporting teams who are enabling a business to create a profit or, looking after customers or supporting people, we don't have the time to face into those systemic problems sometimes. And we do have lots of point solutions that perhaps don't necessarily all band-aid together to solve them systemically. So I think having small dynamic businesses working on problems that they've become frustrated with, and they take that talent and they, I guess, challenge the monolithic tech providers or the service providers by creating new solutions. I think it's a really good thing. It's a shame we do lose them out of in-house teams. But again, I go back to the fact that I do believe there is a skills shortage in some aspects of security, particularly the newer roles. But I don't think that it's unsolvable. And I do think there are other people we can rely on in our organisations to step up and have a crack. And I think the number of startups that we're seeing are being spawned from people's experiences in corporate and the challenges they can't solve for when they're in there. I think what we need to flip on is corporate and large enterprise taking the time to invest in the startups and give them pathways and mechanisms to engage that help them to actually get a foothold in country so we don't lose them overseas, and also to help, I guess, market their talent and their capability more broadly across our enterprises.
You mentioned there about some systemic issues that our industry is having, and one of those systemic issues is a lack of females. And I'm often asked the question around why there's so few women in cyber. And depending on which survey you read, it's around about 11%, I think. Some might say higher, some might say lower. What's your take on this? I mean, have you got an opinion as to why women aren't in our industry, or why they might come to our industry but they don't stick around?
Look, I'm really not sure how to answer the question. I think it's a really tough problem, and if we knew all the variables that result in that 11% or 20%, or depending on which survey you're looking at, we could potentially solve the problem. I have a pretty narrow perspective. I think there's a lot of potential reasons. Cyber is a very masculine term. If we think about what it entails, it's hackers and hoodies. Well, that's, whilst I know of some amazing female hackers, it's not the norm for women to gravitate to those kind of high-tech roles, statistically speaking. And up until this point, InfoSec's been seen as just another IT role, so potentially suffers the same lack of interest as any other STEM job that's out there that we're trying to increase female participation in. And I also wonder, perhaps up until now, whether it's not even seen as a career where your contribution could be highly valued. So, not forgetting that up until recently, for some organisations, IT was still buried in finance. And if cyber's buried in IT, where's the visibility, and how do you give back, and how do you solve problems, and how do you partner if it's buried that far down? And, funny little things like being the department of no and not necessarily having any influence may make it not as desirable for females to want to go into those kinds of roles. And, these days I don't think it's all that bad. I don't think it's that dire. I think we are seeing a shift in organisations bringing business and technology together and moving to continuous delivery, and therefore surfacing up lots of things around, safety, privacy and security, which for me are the three critical aspects of supporting customers, people and data. And they fall well away from that technical kind of bent in some ways, and hopefully could start attracting more female talent. I'd rather look at why do they stay. Maybe that can tell us a little bit more. If we embrace the why on those who do come over and do hang in there, maybe there's some an ability to solve the numbers problem in that. I stay because I'm in a role where my opinion counts, but I'm also in a very senior role. But my team are also in roles where they're quite valued in an organisation that puts quite a lot of emphasis on security, and that isn't always the norm in every organisation, although that is growing dynamically every day. And maybe, we need to market ourselves better around being more dynamic and being enablers and wanting to solve problems that are gnarly and get creative and be curious. And, no day is the same. And if it was, I wouldn't be here. It'd be a little bit boring. And, I'm lucky I'm in a disrupted industry. So there's a lot to offer from a security perspective, as well as a lot to learn. So I think, maybe if we look at pace and stress, some people may not want the CISO gig, but there's certainly some really cool things going on throughout the layers of the organisation, and they're not all technical.
Yeah, and I think too, when it comes to sort of measuring the fact that there are only 11%, or there's a small percentage of women in cyber, what interests me is that that's often the only measure that people are putting out there in relation to diversity. And diversity is a very loaded word, I know, and I get frustrated by the fact that gender is so strongly focused. And I prefer to use the term diversity around culture and diversity of thought as well. What sort of role, if any, does diversity play in your hiring or sourcing plans? And do you think there's particular diversity or particular demographics that make for better security professionals?
Interesting question. I'm on the Executive Diversity and Inclusion Council with AGL. Great. So I get to work with our CEO and the exec team on all the different things the organisation is doing around diversity and inclusion and what it looks like for our business. And I try and make sure our team is reflective of it. So for me, I look at team fit, team gaps and team dynamics, sometimes even before skills. I've got HR people and level 1 reviewers that can pick apart a skills capability in someone who's applied for a role, but really what I'm looking at is how someone fits and what they bring. We don't want teams that get stuck in groupthink and can't be creative. And, I'm even happy for there to be a rub. So in some instances, I've hired people into my team who I know are going to be a little bit vocal and make things a little bit uncomfortable for people. And that's okay. As long as we're playing the ball and not the man, and we're going for a coffee or a beer afterwards, I think that's that's okay, because it brings a lot more to the organisation from a results perspective if we're really challenging each other in what we do. It's really hard on the gender piece, and everyone does seem to think that when you talk diversity, you're just talking gender. And I've absolutely struggled to find female leaders to balance out my team. So for me, it became about building a female talent pipeline, because at the senior management levels in security, they weren't there. But that said, in addition to a gender pipeline, I've also been looking at, cultural balance and work-life experience differences and, levels of career and personal interests, and tried to build quite a diverse team around that. We're also trying to kick off a Dandelion project program within AGL at the moment, which is all about individuals on spectrums who, again, bring another perspective on how to solve interesting and dynamic problems.
Yeah, it's a fantastic program.
Yeah. So I think there's more to be done in that space. I think we're having a crack at it. We're by no means getting it 100% right yet, and I think there's still more that we can do in that space.
You've talked a little bit, in fact, you've talked a lot about what's happening for you currently at AGL. Have you found in terms of sourcing you've had different hurdles at AGL to the hurdles you might have had at ME or some of the other businesses you've worked in?
Around sourcing or just in general?
Around sourcing, particularly for teams. Have you found AGL or somewhere else has presented different hurdles to each other?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question in that, one's a tier 2 bank, another being a ASX listed organisation. And I'd like to say that it didn't matter, but I really think it did. And it is harder to attract talent when you're a smaller organisation. And I think we were punching way above our weight when I was in ME with regards to the type of individuals we did manage to attract to the security team. But that said, I'm fully aware some smaller organisations have a really tough time being able to prove, career path, being able to invest in people's development, being able to pay sometimes at the scale that we're seeing from a security roles perspective, and then showing how someone's really going to be, building on their learning for the next step in their career. So, the hardest thing is finding the time to find the talent. And we're all juggling so much that, meeting with candidates or working with people to try and find the right people under ridiculous schedules is hard to do. But I think at the same time, the biggest hurdles I faced in my previous roles was finding talent who wanted to work in smaller organisations. And I actually find that a little bit frightening from the point of view that smaller organisations need quality security people and need to be looking at their resilience from a cyber point of view as much as the top end of town. And, a lot of these organisations are in my supply chain. And knowing that they've got the capability to secure themselves and to have good governance and good practices from a security point of view is paramount. But if they're struggling to attract talent, we need to have a look at that from an industry perspective on how we help them bolster their security and how we help them find the right people to help them get there.
Yeah, I think the point you made about being able to afford security staff, what's been your experience around salaries over the last few years?
They've increased quite a lot. So I think the downside of the fact that there's so much acknowledgement about a skills gap and an inability to attract talent has resulted in, I guess, roles where we're not getting a lot of candidates, and also candidates being able to demand much higher salaries. It varies across the different kinds of roles that we have available within our teams. And, for some people who have been around for a long time that are working in roles where they've developed exceptional careers and lots of skill and talent, they're in high demand. But then so are others where it's something really quite new, your sec DevOps kind of people, etc. And they're rarer than hen's teeth. Anything in the engineering space at the moment, I'd have to say if I have experienced a skills shortage, it's in that space. And therefore trying to find good candidates with some experience who are prepared to move can be really hard, and then being able to pay for them harder again.
So you've shared a lot with us today in terms of lessons learned across your career and around building teams, but what would be your key lessons learned around cybersecurity teams?
Starting with an operating model. So I think you really need to understand what the capabilities and services are that you're trying to build out for your organisation, and be prepared to implement it in stages. I think that model itself has to be adjustable over time and has to be flexible to your organisation so that your security team can flex and grow and do the same as the organisation does. And revisiting that op model frequently with your team. And getting their views on what it could be and how you could solve some pain points or help your business more. So I think one of my biggest lessons learned was, once designing an operating model, and then designing the corresponding organizational structure and roles around that. If you do that in isolation, you actually miss a couple of opportunities to work more broadly with the organisation to understand what their needs are and ensure that you're addressing that. And you want to create something that's got longevity. So it might serve a purpose now, but then it also has an ability to flex and change with the organisation and suit a purpose later on down the track. And I think in filling those roles in your operating model, always go with your gut. As desperate as we all become to fill roles and look at, don't look a gift horse in the mouth around the talent that does present itself to you. Don't try and put a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't work for the organisation. It doesn't work for the individuals that you try and bring in. So, and if it's not working, call it quickly. I think the other thing too is that, from a networking perspective, in the teams that I've built around the operating models I've had, sharing that information around what you're trying to build and what it looks like with your trusted network, you find out pretty quickly where there are high performing individuals across different organisations, and you can fit them in, and you can look for the opportunities for them in your organisation too. And you know what? There's always a honeymoon period. And I think I mentioned storming to you before. And yeah, been in a honeymoon period for a while, and now there's a bit of storming. And I think just making sure you've got something to anchor back to and a solid foundation where you're impartial for your teams and you're providing them with the right level of guidance, but they've still got that operating model linked to that strategy that underpins everything the business needs. That is their anchor to remind them about what's really important. And finding someone in your structure who's going to be your deputy, who's got your back and can set you up and make sure that, they're the right person for a replacement later on in the future.
I think that's really key to having a really strong team. Is if you've got a deputy, it shows that there is that succession planning and a succession model, and that can be quite motivating for some people in the team.
Absolutely.
The last question I want to ask you, you might have already answered this throughout our conversation today, but the last question I try to ask all of the podcast guests, and that is, what do you wish you had known about building teams when you started as a leader? And it's really about, what would you tell your 20-year-old aspiring leadership self that now, sort of in the with the benefit of time? What would you go back and tell yourself?
The people stuff is really hard. You work really hard throughout your career on security, if that's your domain, and aim to become that leader. And at the end of the day, it turns out you end up doing a lot less security stuff and a lot more people stuff. And it takes up a lot of time. Things don't happen quickly when you're building out teams. You've got to be quite strategic, and you've got to think really deeply on your plans, because you're actually you're having a huge influence on people's careers. So you can't be flippant about what you're designing and what it looks like, and then what it might look like later on down the track. So you've almost got to have a crystal ball around knowing what you want it to be now and into the future, and then how people fit into that and what your team is going to look like in the future, and work your way back from that. And it takes a long, long time. It also takes a lot of time to consider everyone's thoughts, feelings and opinions through building teams. And, aside from starting from a position of respecting everybody's opinion, it can be really, really hard to navigate difficult conversations if you're changing established teams, and even difficult conversations when you're creating new teams, and people are really demanding on your time. And, they don't often have a view of what it means to be sitting in the chair that you're sitting in when you're going through this process. And they are all about them, which is really, really natural thing to do. And you need to be all about them too when you're engaging with them, particularly through, change and building out new teams and designing new capabilities, and making sure that they're confident that you understand what their career paths are, and that you're creating for them as much as you're creating for the organisation. And it's a really, really hard juggling act that if you've grown up through, IT roles or IT/commerce roles, and which is where I've been, and you're not a HR person, you've not done workforce planning and, organizational planning, it's actually a really tough skill to develop and learn around how you have connected, meaningful conversations with people to bring them along on the journey around what you're doing with your teams and to show that you're actually planning for them. And it takes a lot of time. And it's hard work, and it's not security work. So you kind of move away from your domain a little.
Yeah, and I think the fact that your staff, I love your comment about the fact that your staff probably don't realise what you're going through in your role in order to support them, and the clarity that you need to have to look after so many people's careers. It really is a learned skill, and there's a lot of ups and downs, and you're absolutely right, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Sam, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. You've given a lot of your leadership IP, so I'm very grateful for that. How can people find out more about you or connect with you?
I'm a little bit of a recluse, I suppose. I don't put myself out there too much. Do you know I've only just published my first article on LinkedIn?
Mm-hmm.
So I am on LinkedIn. You can find me there, Samantha MacLeod. Otherwise, Twitter is Samm MacLeod. So it's just the shortened version. I tend to stalk more on Twitter than post, but I'm learning. There's lots of retweets. Look, I do get out there so far as I jump on panels, so you may see my name there occasionally for a keynote as well. But, until I get that elusive invite to speak at an event where the audience is someone other than IT or security, where we can actually talk to people who need to know more from a conference, seminar or a meetup perspective to get those key business people and small to medium enterprise, I'm kind of knocking back speaking gigs. So you can find me online on my socials, and that'd be about it at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam, for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.